Hello, I'm Penelope Maver, and welcome to Earth Converse, where we explore our relationship and conversations with the Earth, all in the hope of inspiring a deeper connection with ourselves, each other, and the Earth that is our home. And in episode 1, I said there are some special people in my life, and you've heard from 2 of them, Emerald, Ray, and now Scott. Scot Deily is one of the vision guides that supported me. Last year, I was able to sit as a sort of a co-assistant alongside him. And actually, a year ago, and a year and a week, we were under the aspens, and we were having a conversation because originally I wanted to do this as anthology. Colleague Michelle said, listened to our conversation, said you should do a podcast. And I said, what, with this accent? But she said, no, because, and there's a real fluidity, because there's just, and Scott's got so much wisdom to share. And I have a little secret, because on the Vision Quest, Corey Wright was there, and they ended up together. And so
that's right.
I still remember the sparks. I do. Yeah. And so lovely. And one, actually, if I get her on, I've got the whole Southwest Passage covered, haven't I?
That's
I'll put a link in there. Yeah.
Oh yeah, good.
Yeah. So where are you? You're in a car.
Yes.
Location,
yeah, ironically.
please.
Yes.
It's made of nature.
But I'm actually, I would looking outside, seeing if I could step outside as we do this. So, but I have the light shining through. So, and I think it's important. We say this when we're introducing ourselves a lot of times to people coming for ceremony, but that I don't really consider myself a teacher. Just more providing. I use the analogy kind of a doorman. It's welcoming people into the the hotel of infinite possibilities, which is nature. Helping people kind of check their bags, giving them a lay of the land, but also really this thing about permission and the importance of feeling like people have the ability to access their own this bigger teacher, the natural world, that for eons we were deeply in bed with, and intimately connected through the cycles of living and dying. And I think you hear a lot about the intergenerational trauma and the epigenetics and the research that are finding of how that runs through us and passed through us through multiple generations. But I'd like to also think there's this intergenerational knowing too, this deep sense that we have the ability to connect into this way of knowing and being that is with the backdrop of nature that we were always a part of and forever dependent upon. It's only really a blip in the human history. They're saying now 300,000 years where we were humans, but there's also the ancestral lineage pre-human that I'd like to think is in us, running through us, coursing through us as well. And so there is this giving permission that no matter what our lineage or what some of our ancestors may have done to other people, that we are indigenous to planet Earth, and that we have the capacity, the ability to tap into that indigenosity. And that's in no way divorcing us from the trauma that some of our ancestors inflicted on other people. I think that's part of the being, entering into that as well, and the grief that brings. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying this thing about permission and giving people a sense of permission that they have this within themselves. for many, there isn't the connection to a lineage, or knowing the history. A lot of times that was wanting to be forgotten, not wanting to pass on, wanting them to start fresh and start new, in these new places, this new world.
What is your history? What do you know of your, in terms of your background, and how is your journey into that permission?
I mean, I've done research, and there's um, there's being able to access through genealogy and these different forms and stuff. There's that way of entering into the conversation. But a lot of what I've found, and other people that I've worked with, is that, like I said, a lot of that was lost, deliberately. I think there was this wanting to, um, you know, to spare probably the next generations of the pain and the hardship of what happened, and the reasons for coming over. Um, for some, it was escaping various forms of um, oppression. Like, for some, it was escaping arranged marriage. For others, there was ties to the Jewish, knowing the Jewish history and what was happening um, during that time, and then also um, what was happening, say, in Ireland, and the Irish. So there's different. I think there's different ways of accessing that. There's the personal stories. Some of that can be distorted, but then there's also the historical context, which I think can be really important. And then there is, going out, on the land, and when we're in this ceremonial time, this ability to reach out to those that came before us, and um, the earth kind of being a grounding rod and a conduit for that. In this, in the context of the container of the ceremony, can really help infuse this ability to have enter into these conversations that we don't think we could normally have, and that for those various um, ancestors to show up and to share you know share about some of their stories. And um, I know it can start talking about this can start getting kind of woo woo, but it's like, it's amazing what people have come back
Yeah.
with, and how it has informed the field, and how it has shifted their relationship to home and place.
What have you done round in terms of working with your ancestors or accessing your ancestors?
Something to be said about the imagination, and the ability to we talk about suspending disbelief, and the way of entering into a ceremonial space that um, isn't um, intellectual or mental so much, but it is making room for us to for ancestors to show up, you know, and for them to speak. So it's been kind of that, some of really kind of removing some of the roadblocks that we put in place that says this is not real, like they used to say, as a kid, it's just your imagination.
Yeah.
Right. And
Isn't it just?
yeah, just your imagination. But like, I had actually had an imaginary friend. um
Yes.
and
Great.
well, I let me edit that to say I actually had a friend that wasn't imaginary. I mean, he was real. um and it's really fascinating, because years later I was hanging out with some friends that were they lived on the opposite side of where we used to play. There was a road that separated these two kind of neighborhoods, and the woods that I was playing in was on one side, and there was woods on the other that they're playing in. And um, I had this imaginary friend, and I say in parentheses, um, and somehow it came up in a conversation years later. This is probably 20 years later, and I said the name, and the guy who I was talking to, his jaw nearly dropped when I said the name, because him and his friends had created this whole world of characters, and there was a king, and there was his assistants, and like they had I don't know, they might have made cards or drawn it out, but really very detailed, and they'd play this for hours, and one of the characters was the same name as
Really?
as my as my friend Chucky
Really?
Cuba. And so it's not a very I say his name, calling him here, and
Yeah,
saying his name,
yeah.
that it's not a very common name. So, but so there's these, so it's really interesting the
Synergy.
way in which, um, you know, we don't always get to have that evidence before us. And so the
Yeah.
way their mind can come in and say that's just a bunch of BS, or try to find ways. So it is kind of suspending this disbelief, so that those, that imagination um, can enter in, and take hold,
Mm.
and let worlds unfold, and that can include accessing um, participants in previous generations,
Mm.
our ancestors.
And that's
um,
part of our potential, isn't it? Like, who's to say? That's just another incredible capacity that we have. And I remember accessing on Dragonback's Springs Ranch, my ancestors up in the trees, the sort of the burnt
uh-huh.
trees. And I had no intention of sort of going out there, but it was a real sense of sitting with them.
Yeah.
Really, yeah, I get it. And I
Yeah,
had
and that's, I think sometimes part of the way into that too can be through grief, and the
Mm,
wounds that we've, sometimes we'll give participants, you know, to assignment to, or a mission to find a wound on the land,
mm,
that represents maybe something, your own personal wound, or for me it connected into just the wounding, the wounds that happened um, with with my ancestors, and gave them a chance to share, what happened, um, and can, and so that lives through me, and um, informs me in, so so there's the wounding, and then also, um, I think that was the initial piece for me, that then opened also the possibility of um, this deeper knowing and deeper connection to what their relationship was to place. And I think it seems really timely, as they're talking about humans, the possibility of our time being um, limited with what's happening to the planet, that it's really to go out on the land and to sit knowing that we've been a part of 300,000 years, this lineage. And I feel like it is possible to feel, for them to kind of and come in and to be with us in this time. I think it was the Kalahari that they said, we don't pray to God, we pray to our ancestors,
mm.
because God's so too far away. He's so far off.
Yeah.
And there's this bigness of
Mm,
um, recognizing that the sun will burn out one day, the planet will,
mm,
eventually be no more. Um, and yet we are also a part of this amazing, uh, miraculous experiment of the human that goes back thousands and thousands of years, and to be able to, and at this time, call them forth, and even just to ask for help, or try to make, how to move, in this time, um, letting and bringing them up to date of what's happening and where we're at, and bringing them, making space for them to live and breathe, and I think is really, you know, um, really important. In some
It's a
cultures,
beautiful invitation, Scott. Yeah,
yeah,
really.
some cultures feed, they'll say if you don't feed the ancestors, they'll feed on us too. And so there is this, whether we like it or not. I mean, Jung talked about the dead, they're living in the eaves of the house, right? I mean, they're not really, we're not that separate, or they're not that far from us. And so if that's the case, then maybe what would it be like if we provide an invitation and let them know that we're here, we may not see you, but we get whispers of you, or um, we'd like, to make a space for you at the table,
Mm.
and we need help,
Mm. Yeah, we can't crack this one. And I know myself, just sort of that fierce independent, and but actually not even, it's hard enough to call on my friends and my family. But but there's a whole wisdom out there, and just expand, yeah, and really invite that in as a conscious practice. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think it's, if we're having, for people that are really having to social distance and isolate, um, it is an opportunity to feel not so alone,
Yes.
and to access this imaginative potential that we have, that is, some would say, is not is real, isn't just something we're conjuring up, some fantasy world, but is actually, you know building something within us to navigate these times. And I think doing that in the natural world too, again, is surrounding ourselves not by things that we've created, um, but things that are created us, the elements that run through us. I think there's something about when we're continually to be surrounded by things that we've created, that we develop a warped sense of self. It's like the person looking in the mirror that um, isn't able to authentically see themselves, has a warped sense of self, no matter what other people might say, you know. And so, with that in mind, it's like when we're out and we're seeing trees, we're touching things that are alive and that are of our nature, because we are nature. There is, you know, there's a restorative and reparative thing that can happen, I think, within our system, our nervous system. And so that too really feels important, and that we're able to, we don't necessarily feel alone, that we're participating in this with, even if we are having to social distance or isolated, that there's other ways of connecting with life that isn't through things that we've created.
Mm. Yeah, and the purity, and the Ray talked about actually the non-filters. What is your, like, in terms of your relationship? How has it evolved and deepened? From your earliest memories, and this, where you, yeah, at some point facing this wound and turning to nature for that. What can you share about your history?
Well, I mean, for me, it was at a really early age, recognizing there was something really wrong with the world and the way we were going, and not
How old
having
were
any.
you when you had that sort of thought or feeling?
I mean, there's a certain amount of trauma I had early on that has really influenced and affected um, my worldview, and at a really early age, yeah, um, having an existential kind of crisis, really coming face to face with death, more than once, feeling like that I was going to die, and there wasn't necessarily didn't have didn't have support or anyone that could really understand what I was going through, and so I mean, over I think as I got older, there wasn't anyone saying or showing me the natural world so much. I mean, I got to experience it in moments of being hidden in a tree, um, you know, and just that was where we played growing up. Um, we watched the country become like these cookie cutter houses, and seeing the loss of wild places. Um, I don't know if I really understood that um, in words, but it was more of a felt sense that something was really wrong. And it wasn't until I think um, when it was my 21st birthday, I went out for a 24-hour fast on my own, and not really knowing, not having anyone to really guide me, but kind of just had this sense of needing to go out after reading things and getting to experience more intimate moments in nature that previous summer, realizing I needed to go out and spend time by myself. And I I remember building a really a shelter that was extremely primitive and full of holes, and um, it wasn't yeah, up to snuff as far as protecting you from the elements. And then I but I went out before going to into entering the shelter, because a snowstorm came later that night. But before the snowstorm came, I was out sitting, and there was a deer that approached me. And looking back now, it was like it was the deer, and that it saw me in a way. I felt like I'd been seen in a way that I hadn't been seen before. And that what was transmitted in that moment was that I mattered, that I existed, and I had a purpose. You know, I didn't know necessarily what that purpose was, but that kind of then became my purpose, to find that, you know, and and gave me just this juice for you know, wanting to find this
That gives me
this quest.
goosebumps.
That was a call, kind of like this call to adventure, the
Yeah.
hero's journey,
But isn't
or
that incredible?
heroine's
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah. But on what
Yeah,
initiation on your 21st, such a
yeah,
significant day, you know,
right,
to be seen in that way, and for that
yeah,
purpose to it. Yeah.
yeah. And it was, and then I woke up the next morning after making it through the snowstorm, because the shelter wasn't, um, like I said, it was full of holes, literally.
What
And
day's your birthday? What day was this? Was this
November
in winter?
19th,
Okay.
November
Yeah.
19th.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and just waking up feeling just so alive, and just connected to the living planet, and having a sense of purpose now. Like I had been through rehab in a halfway house. I was 18, 19, um, and being told that I was, you know, an alcoholic, a drug addict, and that I could never, you know, that I was always going to have um, that was always going to be placed upon me. There was tremendous fear that um, of entering into establishments that had alcohol, or being around it. I was really afraid that I would, you know, basically a bottle would like come and just like suck me in, and
Thank you. Yeah.
would be back on you know, the message was like you'd be back right where you were before, or even worse if you took up that drink, or, you know, you smoked again. So there's tremendous fear that was instilled upon me. And in some ways it was it was good that it got me out of my environment, but there was a lot of baggage that was connected to it. And after that experience, ironically, when I went down into town to get breakfast, I had to walk through a bar in order to get to the cafe that was serving breakfast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. The final sort of
it's
passage.
hard to pass on this, for people that haven't been through that experience, but it was just like, in the past, yeah, the amount of fear that was involved was tremendous. And yet now, and ironically, I was now 21, so I could go literally belly up to the bar and order whatever I wanted. And
You had
so it really
permission.
felt, yeah, it really felt like, yeah, this crossing of thresholds. And I had this walk through, but there wasn't any fear. There was just this stride of confidence, not overconfidence, but just an inner innate kind of sense of um, having a renewed purpose and sense of self. And went in, remember eating a bowl of oatmeal and the sun streaming down on me as I was eating that, and just that being a moment of um, perfection in a
Over a
sense.
bowl of porridge. Because
Yeah.
that integration is the hard bit, isn't it? We can, there's profound moments we can have, but then we going back into the day to day, the temptations, the old life, what was your experience and what advice have you got about that?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about that being the hardest part, and that's really where the rubber meets the road.
Mm,
And I think, in previous times and cultures that were rites of passage were woven into the everyday, there wasn't really a separation. That you'd come back from that ceremony and told them who you were now, and this is what you can't, or this is your purpose. And
mm,
there was a sense of like, yeah, right,
mm.
we see you,
Claim it.
you know.
Yeah.
And so that was the challenge for me for years, is I continued to go to nature and doing guided fasts and doing a more formal kind of guided initiation that following summer. um, it, and nature really became my home, and really feeling seen and recognized. But still, there was this tremendous trepidation with being seen by my own kind.
Mm,
And there was, you know, um, a degree to which still wondering if what was happening in those places in nature was actually real, because it wasn't
mm,
necessarily verified by um, those around
mm,
me. In some
mm.
ways, unconsciously, a lot of times those things are kind of invalidated, because you're going against the current, and there is a force of um not necessarily wanting to see you know what you're seeing, because
Yes.
it can be fearful to those that are um a part of them, maybe knowing that they're needing perhaps to do it themselves. you know the part of them that knows that um there is something more than what they've been experiencing in the world. um so there is a survival instinct that sometimes comes in, that wants to tear down anyone that's come back from those places. It's like, so there is this risk. It's like the turtle having to stick its head out, and um
Sure.
you know and that's for risk of having his head chopped off, because you're going back to a world that isn't necessarily um going to really to say, I see you.
Mm, mm,
And so it's not easy. And
mm,
it's, to answer your question, just like how how people how people deal with that, how to integrate that, it's a slow cooking process. And I think it does require, for me at least, having to return again and again, because the the memories fade, or that other world kind of seeps in, that tells us that that isn't true. The doubt kind of can take hold. And I think really important, then, surrounding yourself by people that do really see you, finding and seeking out
mm,
those people,
mm,
and building those communities, um, now more than ever, of really, um, I mean, people are now talking about it because of the pandemic, and how we need to build these pods and think about growing food and not be relying on these bigger systems. And yet I think, you know, or people talking about collapse and what's, you know, the possibility of what's happening with climate change and very real possibility of systems just completely falling apart. Um, but we've always been in community. You know, we've always lived just a short blip again of where we were, um, you know, individuals or independent and just could go, you know, going to the grocery store and getting our food, you know. Uh, so I think it's easy to go to that fear place, and there is a lot to be fearful about. I also like to remember that we've always been in this is how we used to live, you know, preparing for storms, preparing for, you know,
The
droughts,
famine,
for
yes.
yeah, and then just being with others that we recognizing that we need other people,
Mm,
not just to help bring in the harvest, but also to hold us in times um, of grief or loss,
mm,
and
mm.
celebration.
Yeah, and to imagine and to vision and to, yeah, hold that hope.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm hoping this is an you know, crisis opportunity. This is an opportunity for us, for however much time we have left, that it's an opportunity to tighten the bonds, and that with that, as we're entering in so much great unknowns, that our listening capacity, you know, we need all hands on deck, but I think we also need all ears on deck, really listening. Um, and I think to be able to access the wilderness and have a more clear, um, you know, a bigger ear, so to speak, to listening to a larger conversation that's happening beyond media, you know, but the conversations that's happening between the trees and the ground, and being able to have these conversations so that we can come back perhaps with how to move, you know, like Einstein said, we can't solve the problem on the level it was created on. And so how do we access these other places, the imagination, you know, expanding our capacity to imagine something different,
Yeah.
something more beautiful, that is supported by this eons of um, you know, this lineage that we're a part of, human and non-human, that has our backs.
Mm, mm. What how do we go into that conversation?
Yeah, I think there's simple ways, and then there's bigger ways, you know, the
Mm,
simple ways of just setting this daily practice of going out and and making that time for where we're saying here, like you, but whether it's prayer, if people call it prayer or they call it, you know, but saying like kind of letting the earth know, or maybe a particular plant, sometimes that feels too big, the earth, but speaking to a particular plant. I mean, I've had some wonderful conversations and felt really held by talking to a particular flower or a tree, and then you're letting them know this is what's happening to us, and um, can you, you know, what do we do? You know, there is this lament, this lamenting that
mm,
natives have talked about. You know, and you're you're crying out. That that then works into this larger time set aside where there's ceremonial space where you're emptying out um, things from your life, so that so there's space created for something else to enter in. You know, so that's maybe going without food, or now, you know, just leaving your cell phone behind, leaving social media behind,
mm.
um, and again, surrounding yourselves by what you know, surrounding ourselves by the natural world rather than by things that we've created.
You had, when people are coming into nature who are scared of it, that it's really uncomfortable to be in that nature space, whether it's a
Well,
park
I think
or
there
a,
can be some people that actually have experienced trauma, um, and that can be hard. Um, I think it's different if you're a woman. Um, I think it could be different if you're part of a marginalized group that, feeling like, you know, going out and being in nature in solitude, this like, you know, not feeling safe, or people, you come across people that see you wondering what you're doing there, that you don't look like them, I mean, I think um, there's those aspects that are important to identify,
mm,
and that can be part of it.
mm,
And so, yeah, so I think that's very, very real.
mm, mm. I think it is too. Yeah.
But it is really important
Mm,
too that we're doing this with community, and um, that this forms of ceremonies there's um, being held so that we feel like we can go out and really kind of fall apart,
yeah.
to empty out,
Mm.
and that we're not going to be just washed away, or we're going to just be completely annihilated.
But is interesting about the falling apart and emptying out. The safeness, the permission to do that, and in a
Yeah,
really safe, held way. And nature is the perfect
yeah,
holder and guide
yeah,
and mirror.
right.
Mm,
Yeah, the psychologist Winnicott talked about the what's created in the healing environment between therapist and client, and this holding environment. But that's what I love about this work, is that feeling like, um, the holding environment is the people, that come, the guides, then the natural world. It's all creating this holding environment so that we
mm,
feel safe to be able to do what we need to do. And um, so there is this armor that we've had to put on to be in the world,
mm,
and to endure the trauma that we've endured, and to take on these various character structures to remain intact. Um, so what it is really feeling like our nervous system feels safe,
mm,
that we can
mm.
then really be able to do this, and we're going to be held.
Mm,
That deconstruction before we can be reconstructed,
mm,
the dissolving.
mm. And usually, because we've got a growth mentality, or we don't allow that, that imperfection, or we don't, the failing, or that's in
Right.
our psyche, isn't it? And so just to be
Yeah.
able to
And trying to and that's what
deconstruct.
I think. Yeah, there's the mental process of really trying to figure it out and looking for solutions. But
Yeah.
there's like something about dissolution,
Mm.
dissolving,
Mm.
you know, into something, like the metamorphosis of a butterfly, and then it enters into this gooey state where it's kind
Yeah.
of dissolving into
Yeah.
we talk about the liminal stage of the rite of passage, and entering into this kind of, you know something that's dissolving before it can be then formed.
Can you imagine, the leaders of the
Hmm.
world, of corporates, coming into this and really being prepared to dissolve, deconstruct in order to re-emerge
Yeah.
in a healthier way.
Do I think about that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, um it was kind of a requirement in cultures, I think, um and that there's some sort of, you know transitioning from one state to the next, in order for the um the there's the African saying, if the youth aren't initiated, they'll burn down the village to
Mm.
feel the heat. And um, some would say, yeah, they're still just, maybe in adult bodies, but they're youths, running around that are just burning down the village. We're seeing things burning down all around us. And so, yeah, I mean, I think what it would have been like if um, there was this, there was this culture that had that woven in, that our leaders, before they became late leaders, were um, going through that process, the cooking process that um, made them mature, and their decisions were not based out of um, selfishness, greed, that I really see as being linked to trauma. I mean, I look through a
Mm.
lot of it through trauma. Cellist Glendenning talks about kind of
Mm.
the original trauma being our separation from the earth, which
Mm.
begets all other trauma. What would it be like? Yeah, that was held, if they were held in a different way, the leaders were held in a different way, and they were allowed to pursue what they really were wanting to pursue, which probably most likely wasn't buying casinos and, you know, evicting people. So much is happening, and it's hard to set aside time to really let ourselves, just fully drop down our guard and
Mm.
be able to just sit in that.
Mm.
Um, it's not necessarily looking for answers, and uh, but that just being the answer itself, I guess.
Mm.
And that, I think, I've been looking at kind of this talk about the stages of grief and loss that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about years ago, and I don't necessarily see it as that it's a linear process. I think other people are, not necessarily mapping it like that anymore, but that we go through these various stages, and and one of those is denial. And I think just seeing how we're all perhaps moving through these various stages, those that are really feeling the full range of emotions. I think there's some that are maybe just stuck in, you know denial, and moving from that place. But it helps kind of just map out a little bit more what may be happening when, you know what's happening internally, connected to, um, if our systems don't feel safe, they don't feel like there's support to really be able to hold some of these things.
Mm.
There's go-tos are going to be um, some of these different stages, as they call it, um, and I think, how can we be more fluid in moving through those? The anger is really important. There's
Yeah.
times when, yeah, it's too
Mm.
much, and we
Mm.
do need to just check out.
Mm.
But to create this kind of, that there's fluidity in moving through. And I think a lot of times, these kinds of things were so big, like a loss of a community member, something, it was done together. It wasn't meant to be done alone.
Mm.
And when we're talking about the loss of how many species, and the loss of what's happened to, the genocide, the ecocide, that, how do we really have the capacity to hold those things? And
Mm.
I don't think we were designed for that. But I think, how do we do that together? And and being able to let that move through,
Yeah.
and see how that perhaps brings us some new sort of terrain, or some sort of vantage point.
Just thinking about that, like with the pain and the grief and the loss, the intention to actually first the awareness or the pause and turn into that, because like you say, I mean, are we designed to hold it all? But there's this intention to do, isn't it, to make a start. But quite often
Yeah,
we're distracting ourselves, we're just skipping through,
right. And
skipping
I
on the
think,
surface and not dropping
yeah,
down in that,
yeah.
and the invitation to do it.
And I think a lot of times our systems are not, really doesn't feel safe. And as much as we want to do that intellectually,
Yeah.
our nervous systems and our bodies are
Mm.
responding a little differently based on the accumulated trauma that we've experienced
Yes.
growing up, and um, and the ways that we've had to live, um,
Mm.
you know, the ways we've had to, for many, stop being children at a
Mm.
very early age, and the sense of wonder and their bigness wasn't okay, you
Mm.
know, and then having to squash that. So there's intellectually then, like, yeah, wanting to be able to do that or access that, but there's a whole other thing happening. And so that takes time. And there it is creating this safety for feeling like there is something that has our back.
Mm.
So appreciate you doing this, and great
Oh,
seeing you. And
and we'll put a pause here and see you back for the next Earth Converse podcast. Go out and enjoy nature, one conversation at a time.